As we speak, the United States, Ukraine, and Russian delegations are in Saudi Arabia trying to knock out the details of at least an initial ceasefire in the air on energy infrastructure and in the Black Sea on certain transits there. A lot of things that have to be come to an agreement. A lot of details have to be figured out. A lot of agreements between the various sides have to be reached before we can even get to that first stage, heading to what the United States wants and what the Ukraine side has said they want, which is a complete cessation of hostilities leading to a complete and total peace. That's the objective. That's what's going on in Ukraine, in Saudi Arabia right now. But there's lots of divisions here, not just between the two general sides, like the US/Ukraine/European and the Russian side, but even on the Western side, lots of disputes and disagreements, even among some of President Trump's otherwise supporters and allies in the United States. So this is not exactly a great way to start if we looking to get some sort of a near-term agreement, which of course is not good news for the war in Ukraine. That means it's going to continue on as it is as we speak. They're continuing to fight on all along that 2,000-kilometer front. And that's not a good thing if we want the war to come to an end. But let's first of all just kind of take a look at what we've got here in terms of what the objectives are, what the near-term objectives are. Here is Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor, yesterday on U.S. television, explaining what the first objectives are.
Now we have technical teams actually with Ukrainians and Russians in the same facility conducting proximity talks. And the progression will be, we have this ceasefire on aerial infrastructure. That went in place immediately after President Trump's call with President Putin this week. We are now going to talk about a Black Sea maritime ceasefire so that both sides can move grain, fuel, and start conducting trade again in the Black Sea. And then we'll talk the line of control, which is the actual front lines. And that gets into the details of verification mechanisms, peacekeeping, freezing the lines where they are, and then, of course, the broader and permanent peace, which will be some type of discussion of territory for permanent peace and a lasting peace. What the Ukrainians tend to talk about or have talked about as security guarantees.
That is a long list of things there. And let's just kind of break it down so you can kind of get to a better sense of where we really are and where we're going. First of all, he says that these are technical talks that are going on in Saudi Arabia right now, which means this is not even at the level of like Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor and the Minister of Foreign Affairs with the Russian side, et cetera. All of those things are still to be determined later on. If you have technical teams, that means you're just doing the nug work kind of things. That means you're working under the radar here so that when you get closer to an actual agreement between the two sides, that's when you bring in the Minister of Foreign Affairs level kind of cabinet level people. Then he just gets it a little bit closer. Then once they have come to something close to an agreement, that's when you have the principles. That's when you have Trump, possibly Zelensky and Putin all getting together, or even two of those get together. So we're a long way from that happening right now. So there should be very low expectations that anything meaningful is going to come out of these talks right here. And then some of the other things that Wolf mentioned there shows how even those expectations are going to be more tempered, because he says, look, first of all, we want to have this issue on the Black Sea. They're discussing this. There was some talk that when the last set of phone calls was made between Putin and Trump, is that they were going to have an agreement on the no attack the energy infrastructure. Well, that obviously didn't happen, even though Putin said, I've given the relevant order. What he didn't say was the order to do what and when. That was not talked about. The expectation, many interpreted that in the West as meaning, well, then he had immediately stopped the infrastructure. And yet that night there was more attacks. And of course, the Ukraine side has continued to attack the infrastructure on the Russian side. There's been doing some really high profile, just spectacular attacks on another oil treatment facility in Russia over the weekend. Huge flames, a lot of video, etc. So they're obviously the sides are continuing to go out. There was a drone attack by the Russian side in Kiev over the weekend. A certain source that I have sent me some video from outside their window when that was going on. It was really remarkable and frightening to imagine looking at your own home window and you seeing all these explosions up in the air from the anti-aircraft systems, etc. But so that continues on. So what that's telling you is that that's the one right there that I was talking about from the Russian side. Just unbelievable level of destruction. So certainly is hurting the Russians there. They do have quite a few of those facilities because they're such a large country, but every one of those really hit. So you can see why Russia would say, okay, yeah, if we can get a moratorium on the energy infrastructure, that would help us more than it would help the Ukraine side. So that's why they're willing to do it. And yet, you heard Walsh continuing on that they're just talking about the maritime issue right now. That wasn't even close to being addressed in. So at the worker bee level, they're trying to nug out, what can be agreed to, what each side would want to go to. That all of these things take time. Then he said we'll get to the verification issues on the line of contact. That mirrors what Putin had said in his initial response after his phone call with Trump. You remember he made that big sweeping movement about, there's a 2,000-kilometer front and, who's going to verify it, who's going to monitor it, who's going to be responsible if there's violations, what are the mechanisms, et cetera. All those questions that he asked in are now on the table at the technical level. So those things have to be worked out. Then he says, then we wanted to get to issues of, an overall peace agreement. Then we're talking about peacekeepers. Who are they? What is going to be their mandate? What are their rules of engagement? Where would they come from? Where will they not come from? Who's going to be responsible for maintaining them? Who's going to pay for them? All those kinds of things. Then he's talking about the territory that has to be given up. Where is that going to come from? Where is that line going to be? I think he mentioned somewhere, it was either in this clip or one of the other ones that were over the weekend, where, there's the objective from the Western side is freezing the current line of contact. Well, honestly, that's really a non-starter. And I don't know why would you even seek that when the Russians have been unequivocal of saying that the minimum they would even talk about is going to be the administrative borders of all four of the provinces that they annexed in 2022, which includes large swaths of territory in the southern three that Ukraine currently controls. So they would have to willingly withdraw from all those areas and give administrative control into the Russian Federation too. So that is a huge ask by itself. And then as the last thing he mentioned there is that the Ukraine side is wanting security guarantees. I'm not sure where any of those are going to come from. It's not going to come from the United States, not a military security guarantees. Those are going to be more like in type, in kind. For example, Trump has been talking about, we'll take over control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The minerals deal again to where we'll have control over those. So that'll give you a de facto security guarantee because Russia, if they ever attack those, and they're attacking American assets and all that would go along with that. But if anybody's looking for an Article 5 type NATO deal that where if Ukraine is attacked, then this other country will go to war with Russia, I doubt there's going to be any takers on that very, very seriously. But that's one of those are the fundamentals. So that's what they're talking about right now. Those kinds of issues, very difficult, very thorny. The two sides very far apart at this side. The Western side, between if you're talking about Europe, if you're talking about Ukraine and the United States, even there's a lot of daylight there. The Russian side's pretty clear on what they want, but wherever this comes out, there's still a lot of daylight between the two sides overall. So that should temper where we expect anything is going to go today. Now, there are some other issues. In fact, part of that distance in the daylight on the Western side is very much because of the presumption about whether from the West on what Putin actually wants and what he's willing to agree to and how much we can even trust that. Here was yesterday with Steve Witkoff on Fox News addressing one of the charges that is being made against the Trump administration's objectives.
Why are you convinced that he won't press further if he's given some reward or some territory this time around? He's been at war for several years. It's in large part been about those 5 regions. This is not me taking sides. I'm just identifying what the issues are. I just don't see that he wants to take all of Europe. This is a much different situation than it was in World War II. In World War II, there was no NATO. You have countries that are armed there. I take him at his word in this sense, and I think the Europeans are beginning to come to that belief too. But it sort of doesn't matter. That's an academic issue. The real issue here, the agenda is stop the killing, stop the carnage, and that's what we're doing.
So you see that the administration is very sharply focused on ending the war. That's what he wants to do first. You can end the carnage, end the destruction, end the daily loss of life on both sides of the line. Then we can get to those issues here. Whether Russia actually wants to go further or whether they actually want to stop where they are, as they've said, those are hypothetical. Those are theoretical things that would have to be assessed after on the other side of this war. But the first thing that has to come first is to end the fighting in the war, because these other things can't be discovered until after the fighting has stopped anyway. So to delay trying to find a negotiated settlement on the theory that Russia may go further is self-defeating, because all that's going to do is prevent the stoppage of the loss of life, and it's going to continue to help the Ukraine side get ground down. See, Steve Witkoff was on Tucker Carlson. I think I showed you a little bit of that over the weekend. And one of the things that really stood out from that was that he overtly acknowledged that right now, Ukraine is getting ground to dust. We can't just keep going on like this indefinitely. We can't just continue to support Ukraine, quote, for as long as it takes, which used to be the mantra before. The Ukraine army won't survive. The Ukraine army won't survive. Even if you come up with the tanks, the planes, the ammunition, the artillery rounds, the anti-aircraft missiles, all that kind of stuff, even if you came up with all that, the army itself will be ground to dust, and there will be no one to use them that can be effective on the battlefield. That's where we are, and it seems that the Trump administration recognizes that fact. But let's look at the other part of that charge there. That he's going to want to go further. Putin wants to go all the way to Europe. He wants to be like a modern day Hitler. Well, Witkoff there also made a very important observation. This ain't 1939. This is not 1940. This is the very different conditions that existed in World War II. At that time, you had, number one, Hitler had openly talked about his territorial ambitions throughout the continent. He had openly talked about getting more Lebensraum and living space, whatever, for Germans. So that was already on the table that they were actively talking about. That's not what the Russians are doing. What the Russians are doing is they're saying, and they have said for a very long time, for a couple of decades, they're looking for the protection of the Russian-speaking people wherever they are, whether they're in eastern Ukraine, whether they're in Russian territory. They want to defend their interest on their western flank. That's what they have said. They have not said anything about going forward into that. Even if Putin wanted to, though, let's say that he said, okay, well, man, I got all these territories. Golly, I can just keep going more. First of all, you have to answer the logical question, why would he want to? Because it's not just this is not just a board game of Risk, and you can move your game pieces over here and yay, I've got this. Here's the practical implications for what that would mean. You would have to say, as the leader of Russia, that I want to go and we'll take the first one there, like say Poland or Romania or anyone else in that area, possibly the Baltics. Baltics might be a different case, I'll say in a second. But to let's say somebody who's openly antagonistic, and there's not any Russian speakers, like Poland, like Romania, Russia would have to militarily conquer and spend the enormous amounts of money, time, and probably hundreds of thousands of its troops, if not more, to be able to conquer those. And then what? What has Russia gained by militarily conquering Poland? Where do they gain from that? They'll have to now garrison the place. Now then they're going to have to be, not like much different than it was after World War II, where they had millions of troops stationed in all these different places. So now then you have to say, why would they want to do that? How does Russia benefit from garrisoning other countries that now is going to require an enormous outflow of money and diversions of economic wealth and everything else into things that are net losses? Why would he do that? He's not going to. There's no reason why he would do that. And then there's the bigger issue where forget about trusting him, forget about it, taking him at his word. There are nuclear weapons involved here that did not exist in World War II, not at the beginning of it anyway. So if Putin wanted to do that, he would have to, unlike Hitler, have to contend with what if the other side uses their tactical nuclear arsenal or strategic nuclear arsenal. There is very likely no nation on earth that's going to commit national suicide by saying, I'm going to go and I'm going to take this country here, and if I get into a nuclear war, we'll just destroy each other. Because then that, again, gets to, where's the value in that? What's the motivation for the Russian side to want to do something that could destroy the country that they've worked to build for something that is a net loss? It doesn't make any sense. But that doesn't seem to bother a lot of people in the West because they don't want to go down that path. As a matter of fact, Jack Keane on Fox News yesterday went so far as to completely rebuff what Witkoff had said.
Witkoff seems to believe that Putin only wants those 5 regions, and that's false. Secondly, what Putin has said when it comes to Europe is that he is very much interested in expanding into Eastern Europe and returning those countries to the Russian Empire. That is where he's coming from. And he has believed, as his predecessors have believed, ever since in the 19th century a Frenchman set Moscow on fire, and in the 20th century a German got within a few miles of Moscow. They've always wanted buffer states to protect Mother Russia. And that's where Putin is. He wants those Eastern European states for the same reason that his predecessor wanted. So those are the strategic objectives validated by our U.S. intelligence services and also by European intelligence services.
And by the way, folks, we are delighted to have a retired Commodore Steve Jermy on with us today. And he's got some great insights into this. I'm really, really thankful for you joining us in this show today. Welcome to the show, first of all.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Danny. I was listening to Jack Keane. I used to admire him, but I thought, what on earth is he talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm. So he's number one. He's saying that, American and European intelligence have confirmed that this is what Russia wants to do. But I've not seen it. I haven't seen the intelligence, so I guess I can't validate whether that's true or not. Have to wonder how he is, because I haven't seen anything publicly. But aside from whether or not the intelligence services are saying that, just what is the rationale that would have to exist on the Russian side that would make them want to do that? How do you see that?
Well, there's no motive, is there, Danny? I mean, if you think about it from his perspective, and again, I love John Mearsheimer's analogy here. It would not be like swallowing one porcupine, which is Ukraine, but swallowing all of the porcupines of Western Europe. And for what? When you look at the economies of Western Europe, they're all, generally speaking, with one or two exceptions, in deep trouble. So why would you want to take over that? What's the value to Russia? I can't see any value. I mean, we do know that he said in the past that he thought that the way that the dissolution of the Soviet Union happened was a bad thing in the way it happened. But he had never, ever, as far as I'm aware, said that he wants to take over these other states. And again, it's impossible to try and think through what the motive would be. Unless I'm missing something, it really is ridiculous.
Well, that's certainly where I was, because I don't see the motive anyway. You can see, because everybody loves to talk about World War II, 1938, and then 1940. Okay, you could see where Hitler had motivation and he had the means to do it. So there was something to be afraid of back then. There was something to be concerned about in the Cold War. You had, the Communist International. They were wanting to expand their influence. They wanted to sabotage things going on in the West. They had 50,000 tanks and missiles and planes and everything else. That was a legit threat and a legit capability. That doesn't exist right now, in my view.
No, I mean, I think that what we've seen in the way that this war has played out is that it's sort of got the run up to it, which is the warnings time and time again. We will not accept Ukraine or indeed Georgia in NATO. Those are ignored by NATO, and we don't prepare for the obvious thing that happens, which is the war. And then, as the war kicks off, then Putin and indeed Zelensky are very close to a negotiated solution within 2 to 3 months. And then, of course, are persuaded by Boris Johnson and the Biden administration not to take that. And the rest is sad history. So as it becomes clear to Putin that there isn't going to be negotiation, he then reconfigures, he conducts a strategic withdrawal to the Surovinov line, which is heavily defended by one of Russia's best defensive generals. And the Ukrainians then expend not one but 2 and arguably 3 armies on that line. So thereby helping the Russians to achieve their objective of demilitarization through strategic incompetence. It really is a tragedy. It's a tragedy of this decade, and it could so easily have been avoided if we had listened to the voices in the wilderness like the George Keenans of this world and the John Mearsheims of this world, Danny.
And it's also ironic that to this day, as you see from those clips there, people continue to say, no, Putin is a warmonger. He's a territorial acquisition guy. He wants to grab all this kind of stuff. And yet it's the Russians who have been emphatic from all the way back to 2015 they wanted the application of the Minsk Accords. They had in December 2021 an offer to prevent the war from coming out. And then, as you just mentioned there in Istanbul, shortly after it started, another time in 2023, last summer in June of 2024, and the current situation now. Every time you look, they're trying to end the war and end the fighting. And yet we keep saying, well, don't look at any of those words or actions. They're actually just wanting more so they can rebuild, even though they're already building up stronger. They don't have to wait to build up their armed forces. Yeah. They're doing it as we speak.
Yeah, and this. I'm trying to still work out why so many of the Western leaders and their military leaders, as well as political leaders, are so fixated with the political narrative that you've just described, that Putin's the Hitlerian demon and Zelensky is the Churchillian hero. When you look at it, it's almost not quite the opposite, but it's not far off being the opposite. I'm beginning to think that what's going on is that, and I think I've said this before, that the political narrative that is guiding Western operations is so ingrained that we really do have true believers. And when you speak against it, as no doubt you have found, and I certainly have found, we're seen as heretics. We had a joke, Ian Puddock and Ian Proud, that when we said something, that the next cry from the true believers would be burn them. It's almost ridiculous, and it's laughable in one way, but it's extremely sad in another way, because it's preventing the dialogue that would allow us to close this war off. When I was told at the start, that when Russia invaded with 190,000, it was actually less than that, I think, and a lot of them were the militia in the Donbass. That wasn't an army which was configured to invade and take over a territory the size of Ukraine, which is the largest territory in Europe. It would have been like going into Desert Storm with 100,000 men, as opposed to the 500,000 that you went into Desert Storm with. So, thought that he was intent on. There's just no military rationale for it whatsoever.
I couldn't agree with you more. And you talk about the two sides that are talking. So at least now that the Biden administration is out of power and the Trump administration is in, they are talking. And I want to show you what this was just from yesterday. Sergei Lavrov is trying to give voice to some of the frustrations on the Russian side.
In December 2021, we cautioned, you are paying lip service to the Minsk agreements, jeopardizing our security. Let us sign a treaty on European security to be guaranteed without dragging anyone into NATO. Our overture was ignored. In January 2022, I met then US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. He asserted NATO was none of our business and that the only assurance they could offer was some limitations on the number of intermediate range missiles they would deploy in Ukraine. That was it. More hypocrisy, impunity, exceptionalism, and a sense of superiority. And where did it lead? It is hardly surprising that at a major event last year, President Putin said that things will never return to how they were before February 2022.
Now, it's interesting. A couple of things that really jump out to me is that, number one, he talks about how that the Russian side had been looking to make a deal before February of 2022 that would have guaranteed everybody's security, both Russian and Ukraine and European. So far from looking to conquer anything, they were trying to prevent war from happening and saying, hey, everybody's security can be guaranteed here. There was valid differences between the two positions at that time, but those were things that could have been negotiated if there had been the political will on the Western side, which I don't see existed at all.
No, that's right. And I think it's the political will as well as the willingness to negotiate and the willingness to talk through diplomatic means. And again, you come to this very strange situation. I find it particularly strange in Europe. That talking to Russia is seen as quite the wrong thing to do, and yet we've talked time and time again throughout most wars. I think I was hearing only recently from one of Judge Napoleano's guests that the Iraqis and the Iranians talked throughout their war, and indeed I go back to the IRA's campaign against the British in Northern Ireland, and talking continued throughout that, and yet somehow everybody congratulates themselves in Europe that we don't talk. I mean, it's like congratulating yourself that you're incompetent. I just find it very difficult to understand. Right. You know, I think when you try to understand it as well, though, that so ingrained is this belief that it's become, I've said this before, cult-like, and that if you're not a true believer, I now know what it must have been like to be Galileo in a flat Earth society, because actually talking as if the world were spherical and all the evidence, you would have been treated like a heretic, and we're seen as heretics. I mean, the question is what's going to happen, and I think what's going to happen is that in the same way that the spherical Earth revealed itself, then so too will the facts on the ground, and so too will the balance of power and negotiations. I think Europeans are in a strange situation where they have yet to accept that they've lost or that the war is lost, and they keep on insisting that conditions should be imposed on Russia, which is militarily impossible for NATO, even with the US on board, to impose. So how do they think these conditions are going to be imposed on Russia?
Yeah, and in fact, I'm gonna show you in a second how some of that lack of willingness to acknowledge reality is playing out, continues to play out in Europe. But I wanted to hit one more point on Lavrov's comments there and ask you what you think it means, because at the very end of that, he says, but now Putin has signaled last summer that we're not going back to the world of 2022 when I was trying to make deals that were going to be.
Sorry, Dan.
That's all right.
Yeah,
we're not going to make deals, that we're now looking for everybody's security. What do you think he means now, and how does that play into the current round of negotiations?
My guess, and it's one I haven't thought through yet, but my guess is that they're going to take a much harder line when it comes to security, and that actually they will make sure that whereas they would have negotiated in the past and it would have been more give and take, they will make sure that they've achieved their security conditions. So that will be the conditions that they've laid out for some time now, and I think there will be less scope for negotiation. I think we're talking about the key areas of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and open questions about whether they go to the Dnieper. I think they probably will go to the Dnieper, and I'm starting to think that if I were playing Putin's hand, I would. I go to the Dnieper and I have a very, very good look at Odessa, because what I would be wanting to do is to ensure myself not against a Trump administration, which of course is sensibly wanting to talk to Russia and wanting to develop a strategic relationship, but with whatever follows Trump on the one hand, because we don't know who will be in power in 2028. But also, I'm also faced with the vision of Europe, which is going almost hysterical in terms of wanting to rearm and further impoverish itself, having already impoverished itself using sanctions that acted like boomerangs to the European economy.
And, you mentioned a second ago about just this either inability or unwillingness to recognize that the world is round and that the flat earthers are still indominant their position. Here was an interview with the former president of Estonia, Ilves, a couple of days ago, where he's lamenting the loss of Pax Americana.
Basically, that means that the post-World War II settlement is over. You could argue it was kind of wobbly already after the 2008 invasion of Georgia, then after the 2014 invasion of Ukraine. We won't even go into Syria in 2015, but basically, if this stands, then the post-World War II settlement, or Pax Americana, if you will, is over. I mean, it's, it didn't last as long as the Vienna Congress, which is 99 years. But we're in a different world in which aggression is legitimized. It is might makes right, ultimately. I mean, to really go back to Thucydides, the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. That is a different world than any of us who are under 85 or understand.
You know what? I think he's onto something there. I think that this is part of explaining your flat earthers analogy going on, because they really like the Pax Americana universe, where we could literally tell everybody what to do and nobody was strong enough to do anything about it. And that world is now gone, not changing, but gone. It's multipolar. We're still powerful, but so are other players now. So we don't get to just dictate terms to anyone. But I just also find it concerning that he wants to sit there and talk about all the apparent evils of the Russian side, and might makes right, and that you can change borders by force, etc. And I'm like, yeah, like, you mean we did in Iraq in 2003, or we did in Libya in 2011, I think it was, or the recent one where we helped over 11-year period unseat the leader of Syria, etc. I mean, the battlefield is pretty littered with mistakes and disasters. The things that we have done here, using military force to compel compliance with those that we don't like. And so I'm not sure that that's an argument we want to be making.
No, I think that, of course, it's fine for Pax Americana if you were in the American gang. And of course, Estonia, through coming into NATO, was in the American gang. And I think I'm afraid to say, I think the Baltic states in some places have actually overstepped the mark by being overly tough on their Russian minority populations. I think Latvia, is actually getting rid of or taking measures to stop the Russian language. It might be Latvia, it might be Estonia, but it's the same sort of thing. And so because they're in the gang, then they feel happy, and actually they almost feel that they can speak with the feeling that the gang will support them, particularly America, which is the big player in the gang. That's changing, and I happen to think it's a good thing. With the point is that we're going from a hegemonic world with America as the single superpower to a great powers world with three great powers, with Russia, with China, and with the United States. And I think that's a world that we're just going to have to get used to. As you say, if you're outside the gang, a lot of people didn't like America, Pax Americana. We've had the wars, and we've been through them, the 5 wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine, all, I would say, failures of Western intervention. I rather see us sometimes a bit like trying to do open heart surgery with a machete and very poor glasses. And we've proved that we're not very good at it. We've sort of got away with it because those first 4 wars, which I've got in my mind, we should not have conducted any of them. But those first 4 wars, it wasn't critical. We weren't up against a peer opponent. Having come up against a peer opponent, we found that actually we're not as good as we thought we are. And so I think it's going to be a difficult lesson to accept. And I think it's going to be more difficult for Europeans than Americans. At least the Americans have had the moral courage or the the Trump administration have had the moral courage to say, yeah, okay, this isn't going so well. We need to, this isn't top of our priorities either. We've got much more difficult things to do. So this is the time to start to walk away from this. And it's something which the Europeans are still finding very, very difficult to think through, at least at the political and the military, senior military level. There's lots more sense, I think, now of people really wondering what on earth's going on as we try to front up to the Russians for a war that they don't want either.
And, you know, I think it's interesting that he brought up Thucydides there, the Peloponnesian War, and talked about, you know, the powerful do what they want, the weak do what they must, etc. But that also, that whole war there is about a declining power and then a rising power and the dangers that has for security for the declining power if it's not managed right. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that we're in that zone right now, and we better be paying a lot more attention to how to manage this relative decline so that we can continue to have peace and prosperity, as opposed to following in those footsteps where the empire ended up falling outright.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that one of the metaphors I've been using for some time now is that NATO talked about being for collective security, but was in fact about confrontational security and ignored Russia's natural security interests, legitimate security interests. And I think that NATO itself is a critical obstacle in this sort of long-term peace. I think what gives me hope are two things. Firstly, we know that the Trump administration are keen to bring this to a close. And I think there's something to be said for how we help the Europeans stop interfering with that imperative. I think the second thing is that Putin and Lavrov and the Russians have said for some time they want a long-term sustainable peace. Now that's why it's going to take time for the negotiations to happen, because actually getting to that long-term sustainable peace is a difficult negotiated situation. I think I've mentioned before the Peace of Westphalia took some time. I think it was months, if not years. I would have to double check. But the fact that the Russians are interested in a long-term sustainable peace is a opportunity. And in my mind, I'd love to see us grasp that opportunity and start talking to the Russians and work out what that might look like and what the security architecture to deliver that long-term sustainable peace might be. And in my mind, there are two immediate and obvious alternatives. The first is NATO. You know what I think about NATO: no ability to organize. It's failed. We've had a war on the continent of Europe, so it's failed. I think the second is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where the key to understanding how that organization works, the clues in the title, Cooperation in Europe. Russia is a member, Ukraine's a member, all of the NATO members, NATO nations are members. So that to me could be an alternative architecture. I'm not saying that it should be, but what I would think that the Russians would find very difficult now would be to accept, for example, an invitation into NATO. I think I heard Lavrov say to Tucker Carlson in an interview that he didn't really want to be in an organization which was of allies, because that meant that they were allied against something. And again, that tells you, I think, that the Russian mindset on this, I think that something like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe could provide an alternative architecture. And even if it doesn't, it's that sort of architecture which we should be working toward. And I think the Russians would welcome it.
Yeah, I agree. And also the United States, the current administration is thinking along those terms, because even in the Russian media over the weekend, I saw that some of the leaks, I guess, coming out from their government is saying that they're positively inclined to the Trump administration because they're looking beyond the war already. They want to improve bilateral relations. They want to get back to normalization, which is good for everybody. It lowers the chances of the war escalating to the nuclear level or even expanding even at the conventional level. All those things are good. But turns out, though, that because of the mentality you mentioned at the beginning and just the inflexibility of the Western mind here, there's still a lot of resistance to that regardless. For example, here's Steve Erlanger, a columnist, a longtime columnist at the New York Times, who is lamenting about what he calls the naivete of the Trump administration.
What Witkoff was saying to Tucker Carlson in that extraordinary interview, which I encourage everyone to read. I mean, it'd be painful to actually listen to it, but but actually read it, because the naivete of Witkoff in the face of Putin is really quite extraordinary. Russia's saying for a ceasefire it wants to make sure Ukraine gets no more military aid in that period of time, for instance. And that's impossible for Ukraine to accept. Putin doesn't want a ceasefire, let's be honest. He thinks he's slowly winning the war of attrition. I don't think Ukraine really wants this kind of ceasefire either now, because it's worried Russia will just build up again.
I want to camp out on that last part he said there, because I thought, does he actually think through the words he's saying? Does he recognize what that means? Because he says, yeah, Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. Okay, he's probably part right there. Putin may not want a ceasefire because he may want, as you speculated, he may want to go to the Dnieper River, and a ceasefire will prevent him from doing that so that he can control his security more effectively militarily. But then he says, but I don't think the Ukraine side wants a ceasefire either. Ergo, it's naive to think that we can get to that by the Trump administration. Witkoff he was referring to there specifically. Yeah. But I don't think he's tracking that for the Ukraine to stop the process of getting a ceasefire will eventually result in them getting ground down, to which Witkoff mentioned in that Tucker Carlson interview he's talking about. And then that would facilitate Russia going all the way to the Dnieper, as opposed to where they'll go now if we can get a negotiated settlement.
Yeah. I think actually it's interesting to hear him talking of naivete, because actually what I hear is naivete in military strategy. Whether or not, let's take for a moment and assume that he's right. I don't think his assumptions are right at all. But even if they were right, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do militarily about it? We're not about to. America has been absolutely crystal clear that they're not going to go on the ground in Ukraine. The Europeans have been shouting a lot about going on the ground in Ukraine in some sort of peacekeeping force, but it's, of course, critically dependent on a backstop, which the Americans have said that they won't provide. So the fact is that we're in a situation on the losing side and trying to set the conditions for the ceasefire. That will be the first war in history where the loser actually sets the conditions. And between you and I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I'm not putting a lot of money on that one.
Yeah, neither am I, Danny. So I think that the naivete as well comes from this Hitlerian view of Putin. And when the war first happened, I don't know about you, I did not expect it, Danny. But I was quick to have a really good look at it. And amongst other things, I listened to Oliver Stone's interviews of Putin to try and get a sense of the man. And I also read a very, very good biography of Putin. And what you start to see is quite a complicated but clever man with a very good understanding. He's got a postgraduate degree, supposedly in energy economics or natural resource economics. And I've said this before, I think he is extremely strategic. And he's the last person that you want to underestimate, which is what we've been doing. So, I think that when he says things, he generally means them. He said that they said that there was a red line in us marching into Ukraine, and so it's proved. And I think that we would be as well, and especially the Europeans, to actually really review the way that which we thought through this war, work out why we got it so wrong, and work out how we could pick up the pieces from the fifth failure this century, and work out how we might do better. And again, I come back to this it's a very simple approach in the strategy, but it's one of cooperation as opposed to confrontation. Some of the best strategic ideas are the simplest. The great strategic idea in the Second World War, thrashed out between the Americans and the British and the Russians, was Germany first. There was a strategic decision that actually Germany would be the prior, and so much of the strategy that followed was built on that simple idea. And here, I think if we were to move from a strategy of confrontation and aggressive deterrence to one of starting to talk to each other in a measured way, I'm not going to say that we're going to jump into bed straight away and have lots of conversations over vodkas and beer. We probably won't do that, but at least get into a situation where we can start to talk to each other. And a good place to start, I think, would be the militaries. again, I don't know whether you were involved, but I was involved in Partnership for Peace with the Russians and the Americans, RUCKUS, Russia, UK, US naval exercises, and it was a good start. I think once the militaries start talking to each other, I think we would be in a much better place. There's much more mutual respect, I would suspect.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I did have some limited interaction during that period of time. I was in Europe some, probably not as much as you, but obviously I'm a big fan of it. Anything that's going to be moving in the direction of talking, which is and gets to mutual understanding, makes it even possible, as opposed to what we're doing now, which right now, if there's going to be any more talking, it's going to be because Trump is going to take everybody kicking and screaming into it. And one can just hope that leads to somewhere good. But in the last few minutes we have here, I wonder if you can kind of tell me, with the talks going on in Saudi Arabia right now between three of the sides, what do you think is going to come out of those this week? Do you expect anything meaningful, or is it just going to be the next one in line and we'll talk about the next one later?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I sense that the strong negotiating team in terms of who's in it, in terms of their experience, is the Russian one. The Americans are in the negotiation with good intent but less experience, and it'll be interesting to see how much pragmatism there is with the Ukrainians. In a way, the Ukrainians are drowning now. They're going backwards on the battlefield all the time, so you can see why they would want to actually get quickly to negotiated peace. I think the problem, though, is that this will take time. It'll take more time than the Trump administration have calculated for, and there's no need for Russia to go any more quickly than it needs to. Again, Russia wants to be sure now, because of their uncertainty about us and the lack of trust in us, that actually they achieve their objectives and that their security conditions are met. So what I would guess, at least if we're getting into talks about talks and starting to have talks about, for example, the Black Sea and what that might look like, then that's a good start. Again, negotiation has to start somewhere. I don't think it's going to be easy. I think what's missing, of course, is the Europeans, and in a way that's probably good because from what I can see, and across Europe, with a few exceptions, and Poland's an interesting exception, who is starting, I think, to change their position, and one or two of the others are starting to change their position as well, that the vast majority are still wanting to extend the war. Or put it another way, what they're wanting to do is to make sure that the conditions that they think Ukraine should be seeking are ones that we know the Russians will not accept. So by default, they're seeking to extend the war, even if they haven't thought about it that way. But I'd like to see the Trump administration putting more pressure on the Europeans, and I think they can. I think they need to actually tell the Europeans that this is something which the Americans want to move on, and that actually by preventing the Americans from bringing these two sides together and reaching a negotiated solution, that the Europeans are actually acting against America's stated national security interests,
and against their own interest, I will argue.
Absolutely.
And it's ironic, because if they succeed, if the Europeans succeed in delaying or blocking this, all they're going to do is just deepen the loss for the Ukraine side, more territory, more blood. And that's just almost maybe even into immoral to me. That they don't think it through.
I mean, conscious of time. I mean, there is hysteria at the moment in Europe, I would say, about spending for rearmament. People haven't realised that we will never be able to spend to rearm the Russians. The Russian economy is in a much better situation than ours, with much lower debt levels. So even the Germans are talking about taking on increasing debt. And we're about 2.3% here in UK in terms of GDP. It's lower elsewhere in Europe. But what's for sure is that if we want to get close to the rearmament levels, that we need to get close to what we were doing at the end of the Cold War. And I calculated that recently. It's about 6% of GDP.
Whoa.
So what will happen, I'm almost certain, is that we'll have another round of impoverishment. The first impoverishment was when we used boomerang sanctions, which resulted in higher energy prices in Europe, and is having a catastrophic effect on industry. And the second round of impoverishment is to start to reduce funding in areas where we critically need it, especially for capital investment, and instead overdo defence. Not saying that that the defence refresh is not a bad idea, but to take areas from capital investment for productive purposes and put it into defence for destructive purposes is not a good way to use your national budget.
Yeah, nor is it needed for national security. In fact, I would argue it might make it less secure instead of more. But listen, we really appreciate you coming on today and providing these great insights. This is why we love having you on the show, and look forward to having you back again real soon. Yeah, the pleasure's mine, Danny. As I say, as you guys help us stay sane in the flat Earth cult. Yeah, welcome to that group there. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't on your way out. That helps us more than you may think. Also, we are on podcasts, and I know sometimes people don't have time to watch the video, but you do have the opportunity to listen. Be sure and share with us with your friends, because some of them actually prefer podcasts. So go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you'll find us waiting there for you. Thank you very much. We'll see you back this afternoon at 3 o'clock. I'm going to do a show a little bit different of a perspective. We're going to be looking at the other issue that's going on in the United States, and that is in the Middle East and some of the rumblings for potential war there, and what the U.S. law has to say about some things that we need to be much more careful of following. We'll see you then at 3 o'clock this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.